show up in community, embrace the messiness of it. It's not clean. It's hard. Just choose something to be involved with. You don't need to be a leader. You can be a participant. You can be just a hand building a house. You can be a congregant at your synagogue or your church. Don't just talk about it, read about it, get off the couch, interact with other people and show up.
Hi, this is Soumya, and you are listening to Loneliness Busters, a podcast where I talk to founders, researchers, policymakers, investors, community builders, and more on how to build a more connected world. I hope you join the squad. We need all hands on deck now more than ever. Hello, everyone. I am so excited for today's session. I have Sam Pressler here with me. Sam is a researcher at Harvard Human Flourishing Program. He was the founder of Armed Services Arts Partnership, ASAP, nation's largest arts-based community organization serving veterans and their families. Sam is an Echoing Green Global Fellow, Forbes 30 Under 30. He received West Point's Night Out Leadership Award and was featured on Preet Bharara's Cafe 100 list of changemakers. Sam's newsletter, Connective Tissue, is one of my favorite places to learn more about social connection. His LinkedIn says that he wants to make his grandmas proud, and I'm sure this grandson has already made them super proud. Sam is one of the first people I got connected to as I embarked on this crazy journey a few months back. He's down to earth, brilliant, and a dear friend. I love our weekly conversations. We challenge each other, we help each other learn and grow, and I'm excited to give you a sneak peek of our discourse today. Sam, wow, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me. I'm now fully embarrassed and blushing from that introduction.
So I was
I don't have to
right.
hear more of that.
Yeah, I was right that you're down to earth, a little bit too humble. All amazing souls are. So let's kick off. Let's start with your journey and your story. Share with our listeners where you come from and why this issue of social disconnection and loneliness matters to you.
I have both the benefit and the challenge of growing up in the same town that my dad grew up in, my uncle grew up in, my aunt grew up in, where my grandma and grandpa helped found the temple and the YMHAs. And I had this experience of being deeply known and deeply supported, both communally and familially, my entire upbringing. And that was, on one hand, definitely in the moment, I think I took it for granted because being deeply known when you're a 14, 15, 16-year-old is annoying and scary. But as I've gotten older, I see just how fortunate I was to have those kind of supports in place, being in a place where people knew your name, people knew who you were, people knew who your family was, people were looking out for you. But I also had the experience of later in my high school, some pretty significant ruptures or tears in the fabric of my community, having a close family member die by suicide, having issues in my community around addiction and overdoses. I was frankly feeling lost myself, was not connected to what I was doing in school, and I forced myself to take a step back and say, what was I passionate about before the world got in the way? And for me, that was upon reflection, there was two things. That was humor. Growing up, humor was how we coped, humor is how we connected with people, and it was service. Based on my family background, it was an expectation and something that was a big part of my upbringing. So I had this sense of, okay, why don't I do something at the intersection of humor and service? And that led me to this idea of doing a stand-up comedy class for a specific group. Mind you, I had never done stand-up comedy before.
I was just going to ask, were you the clown in the class?
I was the clown.
Did you do stand-up comedy before?
I made silly YouTube videos when YouTube was coming
out. That counts.
But I don't think...
People have made millions and millions of dollars doing that now.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I was not one of those people. But there was definitely this humor in my background. But I really came back to campus, and that sprang with a solution looking for a problem, which I think everyone in the social entrepreneurship world or whatever will tell you is you're not supposed to do, but that's what I did. And it was actually later that spring, that's through research I was doing on veterans issues for a class that I was in. I was like, oh, wait, this could be a really interesting community with which to work. I had a connection to it. Both my grandparents were in the military, but I wasn't a military kid by any means. But it was this sense of like, there's this group of people that both, are experience like a disconnect from civilian life when they transition back into it, and feel communities don't necessarily understand them. And so it's like, well, okay, like humor's how we cope with hard times. Humor's how we connect with others. Let's do the stand-up comedy class for veterans. And fortunately, at that time, I was in Southeast Virginia at school, and that's where there's a huge military and veteran community down there. And so
it was meant to be.
In some ways, I think there's this, you need to really study the problem. You really need to hone your solution. Or you can just be a 20-year-old who's never done stand-up comedy before, never done anything before, and just
or you
do
could
something.
be a 33-year-old and not know anything about the issue and just leave your job to figure it out. In so many ways, ASAP is such a unique concept. I'm always like enamored by the power of arts and humor and play. And so often we don't utilize it to its potential, if at all. How did you, from an idea that, hey, I have a solution, to creating a community of people who got impacted?
Yeah.
Thousands of people got impacted by it. How did it evolve?
It's still evolving too. When we said, okay, we're going to do this class, one of the first things we did, it was me and then actually another classmate of mine who actually had some stand-up comedy experience. We put this class together. His name was Ryan. And I think the thing that we did best from the start that has continued to be the most important thing was say, we're not veterans, we're not artists. And as such, we don't know what we're doing, but the community and the population with which we're working does. And that was a principle that was there from the beginning. And as it went from this one stand-up comedy class, the feedback we received was, I love connecting with fellow veterans. I'm also interested in other art forms. And so then we added creative writing classes, we added music, we added more while we were still in school. And then it was very clear as we were evolving this, people didn't want to just do this as connected to a student program. There was really this desire to be kind of part of a broader community. And so that's as we evolved and transitioned it from the student group that we were running at William Mary to this nonprofit organization that would potentially be based in a number of communities and in partnership with local arts ecosystems. There's this element of centering the community and the trajectory of the growth that I think has been instrumental for it to just be a meaningful and authentic experience for those who are involved. But let me just, before I get into a little bit more about what it makes it work, let me just explain very briefly what it is. As we went from the stand-up comedy class and evolved it to this bigger student organization, ultimately I was able to get some funding from this Echoing Green Fellowship that helped me turn the student organization into a nonprofit. And essentially the way the nonprofit works is at the individual veteran level or the individual veteran, service member, military, family member level. We offer a range of classes, workshops, performances, all at the kind of entry level of the community arts. So from stand-up comedy to improv to storytelling, creative writing, wherever. And the idea is we want to provide you an accessible entry point to the community arts. We want to help you when you get into it, build skills, connect with other people, develop a sense of purpose. And then we want to have a pathway for continuation, right? So it's when you finish a workshop, when you finish a class, when you finish a performance, you have an answer to the question of what's next. And the way that works is ASAP continues to have a number of workshops that are going on at all times, a number of classes, a number of performances that you can continue to participate in. We also partner with the local arts ecosystem in every region that we serve. When you go through an intro level improv class with us, say, you can then continue on in the higher level improv classes, but as part of the broader arts community. So we're not separating veterans from the community. It's using arts as a pathway towards broader integration into the community. And then the final thing that we have, which is super important, is a leadership development program. So you've gone through the class, you've really benefited from it, and you want to pay it forward and serve others. Now you can go through training to become an alumni mentor, and then eventually become an instructor of the class to teach those classes to others. So now the majority of our classes are actually led by the alumni of those programs. And so when I think about, you asked the question about the magic of it, I think there's a lot of different things. One, it is going back to centering the community and recognizing that we're not experts who know what's best for veterans or service members. The people in the community both know what's best for them and have the capacity to shape it. Two, I think there are a lot of arts programs that want to do arts for veterans. It's like, oh, like these veterans, they need like the fine arts. Maybe there's something there, but like really, it was like, no, we want to meet people where they're at. You should do stand-up comedy because comedy is the most popular art form and it's accessible and it doesn't seem it's something that's different from their lives. And then that humor, stand-up comedy can be an entry point to other elements of expression, storytelling, creative writing, things like that. And I think the third thing that's just super important is that leadership development component. When we started, we had no sense that there would be this like pathways for serving and growth within the community, but it was just people would say, hey, I think I could teach that comedy class. Why don't you just let us teach it? And we're like, oh yeah, that's a pretty good point. And so that's become this really powerful avenue. I think when you're building a community organization, you want to provide a pathway for people to both grow through your organization and grow beyond your organization.
One of the things that you mentioned, which resonates, is how do you build with and not for any community, right? How do we not go in with the perspective of I need to solve their problems, but just give them the platform to solve the problem for themselves because they know what to do. They just need a little bit of encouragement. Really powerful. Thanks for sharing. Let's turn gears a little bit. Over the last year, you've dedicated more and more time in really understanding the issue of social connection. You and I have had the conversation around language and vernacular of loneliness. Of course, in the past few months, loneliness has been talked about almost everywhere, from the top media houses to healthcare leadership to policymakers, politicians. What is your perspective of focusing on loneliness versus social connection community? Do words matter? Why do they matter?
Yeah. I tend to not use the language of loneliness all that much. It feels very subjective to me, and it is. It is a subjective measure. I guess there's a few things that I would talk through. One, I'm very interested in the notion of institutional decline or breakdown. I mean, a lot of this is coming from Robert Putnam's research, but it goes well beyond that. We've seen these key institutions that promote a sense of connection in life, that promote a sense of meaning in life. We've seen those institutions erode and erode at higher rates in terms of success for folks lower down on the socioeconomic spectrum. And I kind of break that down into religion, civil society, community that's non-religious. You have unions that have declined. You have work in and of itself. And then you have particularly family structures. Those five things have all declined over the last 50 to 60 years, and more so for people without college degrees lower down on the socioeconomic spectrum. And so when you think today, where do you participate, kind of engage in the process of participation to cultivate the relationships and the commitments and the accountability, we've seen a deterioration there. And so I think a lot about that is the structural change that's going on that would then lead towards more social isolation, in particular for specific groups. The second piece that I'm particularly interested in and concerned about is the mass sorting of our population by class. You have this on multiple levels. So you have the regional level of sorting where you now have people who have college degrees, particularly like selective degrees, go to a set of a few cities where they interact with other people from similar backgrounds themselves. And then within those cities, you have the wealthier or the more well-off neighborhoods. What we've seen is a greater polarization in superstar versus distressed regions. And then at the neighborhood level, superstar versus distressed neighborhoods. And we're actually seeing fewer mixed income neighborhoods from a socioeconomic perspective. And you'll see in Raj Chetty's research, he really shows just how sorted we are by class. And actually the top 10 to 20% are the most sorted by class in terms of their friendship networks. And so if we think about this from a social connection perspective, there's a subgroup of people who don't have access to these relationships and the participation to cultivate the relationships that provides us the support from a health perspective, from an overall well-being perspective. But then if we think about this from an economic angle, we know that these cross-class relationships are the greatest predictor of economic mobility in life. we're seeing our relational life both reinforce the inequalities, both in terms of health disparities and in terms of economic disparities and many more. I think about it in that way, less about loneliness, not to diminish the role of it. It also gives us at least a charge to start to think about what can we do about this.
What you're talking about at the highest level is the social infrastructure that is needed. Loneliness in a lot of ways is an N equals to 1 definition, right? You feel lonely and it's your perception of how you feel. And Surgeon General talks about the feeling of loneliness, the repercussions of that on your body, on your mind, contrasting to what you're talking about is a systematic infrastructure, either institutions, large organizations, and processes for interclass mingling, across generations, economic strata. You talked a little bit about sort of the decline of religion, the rise of single-parent households, the rise of divisiveness, pessimism that we see in the news and the polls, and then you overlay that with the friendship recession or the loneliness problem, whatever you want to call it. How big of a cultural revolution is needed to build a culture of connection in the US? Is it a revolution? Is it a nudge? Where are we and where do we need to be?
I guess if I were to start with culture, I think there's been a decent bit of research around the degree to which we are at a stage of hyper-individualism. One of the things I think is really important is how do we blow up the framing of this away from the individual and towards more collective. Even when we talk about loneliness, it feels so individualizing and individuating. And so one of the things that I think is just like really important is like, how can we have language that is more capacious, that allows for us to think of the individual and the collective and not just as part of the collective? What I'm most encouraged by is a growing recognition of the myriad challenges that we're experiencing, some of the structural challenges that I was talking about, some of the technological challenges that have come to the fore in terms of the role of social media, cable news, all these, both from a polarization perspective, but also from an isolation and loneliness perspective, alignment on where our culture is in terms of consumerism and individualism. So that is encouraging. There's a lot of people from a lot of really different backgrounds who are seeming to align on the challenge. Where I wonder where we're going, is there a collective cultural movement that can come? And I think that's going to come from people who are on the ground, right? That is going to come from people recognizing that the fundamental conditions in their communities are unacceptable and they want to live in a different way. There are so many people who are already doing this work. I was just on a phone call just before this with a guy, Dale King, who's in Portsmouth, Ohio, who's basically built a CrossFit gym that also serves as a recovery integration center that has completely transformed the community. There are people like Dale King that are in every community in this country. And those are going to be the people who have the spiritual and moral courage and the proximity to the problem that are going to drive this change. And then we ask the question, what is the role of policy? What is the role of business? It's enabling them, right? It's if they're the flames, it's giving more air to those flames. And policy, I think, can play a role in getting out of the way. So what I mean by that is if you're someone working in the retail or service sector, in a lot of places, you don't have control over your schedule. You may have to work 2 to 3 jobs just to get by. If you can't plan your weekends, how are you going to plan to be with your family? How are you going to plan to participate in community? So there's a real policy there, and even just protecting some of the leisure time of people so they are enabled to be parts of these movements. And so I think there's for people who are thinking about this in the theoretical way, I think we need to center how important the community builders are and think about how can we give them more air, more oxygen to lead from the bottom up rather than dictate from the top down.
So we do need a revolution, is your answer.
Peaceful one, hopefully.
Peaceful, fun one where people connect with each other. Yes, we will get to the role of policy and government.
Yeah.
But before we go there, it would be a miss to not talk about technology and the role of technology to where we are now and the role of technology going forward. Of course, how we live our lives is how we live our days and how we spend our hours. And there's a recent report by Surgeon General on youth risk behavior and social media. daily media usage is anywhere between 5 to 8 hours a day for Americans. Teens are almost constantly on social media throughout the day. A lot has been written about the issues of creating technology without thinking through the social implications of those. What do you think about technology's role going forward? Would it continue to be a peril? Can we turn it into a blessing? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. Specifically, what technologies are we talking about here?
There's the traditional technologies that help you connect long distance, etc. But we are at a cusp or an inflection point in how we use technology day to day, and AI, generative AI, LLMs, all of those are going to change how we use technology and how pervasive it is on even more parts of our lives. So yeah,
Mm.
generally technology and specifically the new frontier.
Mm. Yeah. So I'm definitely not a techno optimist. I think some of the things that we've talked about is how do you use technology as a tool to get people into healthy, whether healthy from a health perspective, healthy from a democratic perspective. And I think there is a specific role for technology, both if people want to be in online only spaces, there are great groups, the new public, who are really thinking about how do we cultivate these healthier online spaces that are not reinforcing division or isolation, but actually promoting connection, belonging, anti-authoritarianism. I think also we can think about how can technology play a role in getting people from online to in person, and what is the role of technology to address one of the thornier problems in the American context. How do you get people who are socially isolated already, who may have 0 or 1 friend, how do you get those people into community? And there is a role for technology to play there in being able to reach those people and then be able to nudge them into in-person or at least virtual community as a starting point so they feel more connected. And so there is a clear role there, and to say there is no role of technology would just not be pragmatic given the current state of the world. There are a number of things that concern me. I'm very concerned about the rise of AI platforms and bots that are essentially replacing friends for people who are feeling disconnected or lonely. That feels very dystopian to me. For some of the companies that have benefited from the technologies that have played a role in our division to then invest in companies that are providing synthetic friends for folks who have been affected, that feels very concerning. And I think there needs to be at least a social stigma around that, if not questions around regulation of, is this something that we as a society say is we're okay with? Because it does feel, for me, it feels predatory. And then we need to recognize from a purely capitalistic perspective, how much our technology is creating competition for our leisure time, for our time that we can spend in community. The very business model of Netflix, for example, is to keep people on Netflix as long as possible. We
Their
think
founder actually said that their biggest competitor is not any other company, it's
sleep.
And so it's on record. That's how they think about engagement
And we
and
think about like
utilization.
binge drinking, we think is bad. Binge eating, we think is bad, but binge watching is a strategy, right? We need to recognize, like, for every moment that someone is spending in front of the screen streaming, they are not using that time to participate in community, to potentially be with their families, to be involved otherwise. And that's not a new thing. That one of the main things Putnam points to in Bowling Alone as a driver of kind of the shift away from gathering was the introduction of the television. And this is that on steroids.
I'm a techno optimist. I hope there is a new generation of founders and entrepreneurs. The issue of synthetic friends, it scares me too, to be very honest. I don't know how I think ethically about it, but anything that will make our children sicker and not healthier should be considered. Now, the practical problem is that most of these technologies will not start as, hey, I'm your best buddy, right? The best friends that will be synthetic will creep up with the use cases that sound amazing today, but over time they'll become more and more general. And so thinking about what our next steps are, and is regulation the way out or not, because even policymakers don't know. So it's tough. And then, of course, the problem of addiction and engagement as a metric for success, which is now very well recognized in the health world. There are measurable changes to your mind and body, increased risk of depression, anxiety, even heart disease, etc., if you use social media. Let's go on to the role of policy and government versus
Just
private.
one thing on
Go
that
ahead.
point, I think something that sticks with me a lot. I read it in one of Wendell Berry's essays, but it draws on, interestingly, the Amish theory on community and technology. And the Amish are misunderstood in some ways as just being anti-technology. For every new technology that's introduced, the question is, what will this technology do to the fabric of my community? And I think the challenge historically of the things that we're talking about is there's been a techno-optimism where we're not asking what are the implications of the introduction of this technology for our shared lives together. And then we go and we deal with the consequences and we try to push back against it. Can we collectively have a proactive set of questions of, do we want to introduce this, and what are the implications of this will enable my community to be more connected? Awesome. Let's explore that. But let's also have a conversation about the implications in the other direction. And that's just not really there. So that's one thing I'll just name.
I always hesitate to think about the role of government and policy on this versus the role of capitalism and self-correction. I do think we have created in the last 2-3 centuries companies that we are not all proud of, whether it was the smoking industry or the sugar industry and now the social media industry. So it does beg the point on whether we should be thinking about upfront the ethical and the societal implications of these technologies. I think every company should have a chief ethics officer. It's good for business. Think about all of these companies now, whether it's the smoking or the sugar companies, right? Eventually, longevity comes from doing good. So I hope every company does have a chief ethics officer or a chief community officer who has a seat at the table. But at the same time, a lot of it is to actually see how the culture of the next generation forms. And I'm very optimistic to see what's happening. The flip phones are back, and there's a portion of teenagers who don't want to get, oh yeah, here you go. Don't want to get on social media early on. Parents are actually also taking an active role. I'm optimistic, but I think cautiously optimistic. Let's talk about role of policy and government.
Okay, I will push back on that.
Because I do want to get to that. That is one question where a lot of Americans have very different perspective on how big the government should be. Should you have government in your family and your religion and in your bed? Like, where is the boundary for government to get involved in my friendships and my social connections? So talk to me about your view of the policy and what role government should play.
Yeah. The first thing I'll say is this is not a new question, right? In American history, we go through back and forth between how do we balance liberty with the common good. And the key to America is always holding those two things in tension. I do not think, what I was saying earlier, I do not see policy as the driver here. I see community as the driver, and I see the cultural change emerging from below as something that's most important. But I do see policy as potentially an enabler here of the good work that can go on to make people more connected in the places that they're from and the places that they live. And so, full disclosure, I'm currently working on a framework to try to answer this question more cohesively. I think there are things that we can think about as leverage points right now. So the leverage point that I always go back to, and I'm not the first person to say this, is the period of time when we leave childhood and enter adulthood. The adult transition feels like an incredibly powerful moment in time where we can potentially leverage government policy to foster connection across difference, to cultivate habits of participation, and to actually really have ripple effects of changes both in childhood leading up to that adult transition and afterwards. There have been pushes for national public service in the past, but I think looking at that period of adult transition as an opportunity to foster those connections, as an opportunity to cultivate habits of civic and communal participation, and as an opportunity to cultivate some formation of what it means to be, what the good life looks like, what it means to be a good citizen, neighbor, etc. That feels really important to me and in an area where we can make meaningful progress. And I see a lot of momentum here. Governor Moore in Maryland has just created a Department of Civic Innovation and Service, which has established this Maryland Service Year option, which is enabling Maryland high school students to take an extra year to participate in public service with community organizations from people across Maryland. I think you can see that potentially replicated at state levels across the country. And there is interest in this actually from both blue and red states. So that's really exciting to me. But I think we fundamentally need to look at this area of adult transition as this hinge point of what happens before and what comes after, and recognize that we basically went from no adult transition pre-World War II in the United States to the World War II created the adult transition as we know it, with basically all capable young men joining the standing military, to then after World War II, we saw a significant decline in our military force towards Vietnam and then afterwards because of the creation of the all-volunteer force. And then simultaneously, the kind of development of this idea of college as a meritocratic institution where the cream rises to the top. That's the kind of college system we're in right now, where you go to a selective 4-year college and you're going to interact with mostly upper middle class people. If you go to that selective 4-year college, you maybe go to a local 4 or 2-year college, community, private, whatever it may be. You're commuting. You don't have that cohort-based experience. You're maybe working while you're in school. You're connecting with a much typically more middle class and working class group of people. You have 1% that joins the military, or you just go into the workforce. And there's nothing right now at that adult transition that actually fosters that cross-class connection, that kind of cultivation of habits of participation that can be extremely powerful in terms of our friendship networks that come after, but also how we orient ourselves in childhood before, right? You have more well-off parents hoarding social capital in clarinet lessons and travel sports and all these things so that you can be positioned to get into college. If we reorient that moment in time, my hope is that it changes behavior in both directions. Reasonable people can disagree with me. So that to me is this one main area. And then I think we look down and there are specific other areas we can think about. I think about housing a ton because the way that we do housing shapes the people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis in our neighborhood. And I think the possibility to create more mixed income neighborhoods through changes to the zoning laws could be really helpful, but it's not a panacea. And there are a number of others, but I always tout the adult transition piece because I just think it's the one, if I could put my finger on one thing, it would be that.
You're absolutely right. We have created a pressure cooker, right? All the youngsters are in this race to get into the best colleges. There's no unstructured playtime. They play for their resume, which also defeats the purpose of the play.
The instrumentalization of play, right?
Yeah. And I do believe that having worked in the private sector for so long and having gone through a burnout myself, coaching people out of burnouts, the vision of the life youngsters create when they are in their early 20s, late teens, it's so counter to what actually creates a happy life. And there is both, of course, social, emotional learning and skill building that's needed, but also an ability for us to create spaces for them to discover themselves and have fun. Isn't that a saying, all work and no play makes Jack, Jill, Sam, Soumya, a dull boy, girl, etc.?
I'm waiting for your policy when we have our monthly Saturday that's just for play. I remember you were telling me about that idea.
Yeah,
I don't know how we're going to...
my vision of the world, where every Saturday, everybody gets out in the public places and just has fun. I think we've forgotten how amazing the world is because we are too stuck in our screens. And it is interesting how different our perspectives are on technology, this and that, but there's so many spaces where you completely are aligned in terms of what to do and how to do it. This was a fun session. Let's close out with a couple of personal questions, fun questions, hopefully. Tell me, what is your favorite social connection ritual? What do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun?
Or connection. It could be fun or otherwise.
Yeah. One of my favorite... So I'll give you two answers. One of my favorite things to do is to host dinners on a Friday or Saturday nights, bring people together without much of an agenda, but maybe there's a topic of conversation, whatever it may be, and not have a calendar where it's from 7 to 9, we're doing dinner. Just say from 7 till whenever you're here and create that unstructured space. I've always feel warm fuzzies inside when I do that. And then I think for me, the second thing would be sports and basketball. Basketball has been a huge part of my life. It's an immediate way to connect with people, but it's also one of these things that's not for the purpose of connection. It's for the purpose of competition, exercise, all these other things. I think somewhat paradoxically, I'm actually someone who really needs my alone time. And I feel I'm better able to connect with other people when I have time to myself. And so one of the things I try to do is once every other month, is go on some retreat by myself, silent retreat, and just be quiet for a few days and reconnect with myself a little bit so that then I can reconnect with others. Yeah, those would be a few come to mind.
That's awesome. Any message to other loneliness busters who are seeking to create a more connected world? Or what's the name you have? Community curious. Message for other community curious souls.
I was actually just talking with my friend Maya Pace the other day, and she's someone who I see as a kindred spirit in this work. She had right out of school helped start a community organization and really thinks about the relational elements of what it means to build community. And the thing I'll say is it's one thing to talk and read and research about these things and think about this from the theoretical level. What I think is also great is to show up in community and embrace the messiness of it. As she was just saying this to me the other day, and it's not clean. It's hard. It's not, if it was easy, more of us would be doing it, but just choose something to be involved with. And you don't need to be a leader. You can be a participant. You can be just a hand building a house if it's a service project. You can be a member of a community arts class if it's that. You can be a congregant at your synagogue or your church if that's where you find yourself drawn. But I think the thing that I give is don't just talk about it, read about it, get off. How do we get more of us to get off the couch, to leave our homes and to interact with other people and show up? And that's something I honestly, in the last few years, as I've not been running ASAP, I've at times struggled with myself, because it's a lot easier to read about these things and to talk about these things and actually practice it. And so how do we think about this as a practice while simultaneously working to re-envision the structures to make that practice easier for people to get engaged with?
On that note, I should formally invite you for unstructured dinner time at home when you're here. So we can also not just talk about it, but do it.
Let's do it.
And we should do a potluck, or you can cook and I can cook and we can share some meals together. It was wonderful having this conversation.
Thank you.
If you're still here, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend who you think should join the Loneliness Busters squad. See you next time.